Okay, so today we're going to do a deep dive into something I think is so fascinating.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited to talk to you about it.
Okay, cool. I'm excited too.
We are talking about creative thinking and analytical thinking.
Nice.
So we have a ton of different sources today.
Fine.
We have some sources that are about how to actually define creative and analytical thinking. And then we're going to talk about some real world examples. We've got Apple, we've got like the marketing world,
Yeah.
and then we've got some innovation gurus like Edward de Bono
Interesting.
and IDEO.
Okay.
And then we have some stuff from the Harvard Business Review.
Okay. Awesome.
So we're kind of coming at this from all different angles today, and our goal
Yeah.
is to see if we can figure out how creative thinking and analytical thinking can actually work together.
Right, because it seems like they should be these separate things,
Yeah, they seem totally opposite.
but they're not.
Yeah.
So interesting. To start out, let's just talk about what creative thinking is.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory.
It's coming up with new ideas, right?
Yeah, I think one of the sources talked about it as looking at things from a different angle
Yeah, that's a good point.
or making connections that other people aren't making.
Yeah, and challenging assumptions.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people think of creative thinking as like, oh, the arts.
Mm-hmm.
But really any field, any job,
Right.
you need creative thinking.
It's problem solving.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so there are a bunch of different techniques that our sources talk about for fostering creative thinking. So things like brainstorming.
Yeah, good old brainstorming.
Yeah, but our sources talk about brainwriting.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that, where you write down your ideas first before sharing them
Yeah.
so that everybody, gets their ideas out
Yeah, it's good for like,
and the loudest person doesn't dominate.
exactly, yeah. Or like brain netting.
What is that?
It's the same kind of thing, but online.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if you have like a remote team,
Yeah, go.
and then there's this really interesting thing called Scamper.
Scamper, what is that?
It's an acronym, and it stands for Substitute Combine, Adapt Modify, Put to Another Use, Eliminate Reverse.
Woo!
It's a lot, but basically it's just like a structured approach to brainstorming.
Mm,
Like, let's say you're trying to improve a pen.
right,
You could substitute the ink for something else. You could combine it with a light.
right.
You could adapt the grip.
Oh, I see.
So you're kind of just like going through this list and seeing if you can come up with new ideas.
That's pretty cool.
And then something that I really like is mind mapping.
Oh, yeah, I love mind mapping.
I'm a very visual person,
Yeah.
so I like being able to see everything laid out in front of me.
Yeah, and it's not just linear. It's
Yeah.
hierarchical, and you can
Yes.
you can see the relationships between different concepts.
Yes.
It's like a web. Yeah, and then there's design thinking, which we talk about a lot on the show, which is a whole process.
It is.
But essentially, it's like a human-centered approach
Right.
to problem solving. Okay, so we've talked about creative thinking. Let's switch gears and talk about analytical thinking.
Right.
Okay.
So this is kind of the opposite side of the coin, right?
Yes, it's about being very methodical and structured and
Yes.
breaking down complex problems into smaller pieces
Yeah.
and then interpreting data to find patterns and draw conclusions.
It's very logic driven, right?
Very much so.
So you need to be able to really think critically and make evidence-based decisions.
Absolutely. And it's so important for navigating the world. Like, we're bombarded with information all the time.
Right.
We need analytical thinking.
To make sense of it all.
Exactly.
So how do we get better at analytical thinking?
Well, our sources talk about a few key techniques like logical reasoning,
Yeah.
which is basically understanding how to move from general principles to specific conclusions, which is called deductive reasoning, or going the other way around, looking at specific observations and forming general hypotheses, which is called inductive reasoning. And then there's data analysis, which is so important these days, like being able to gather, clean, interpret, and visualize data.
Yeah.
And then I think a really important aspect of analytical thinking is critical evaluation.
Oh, yeah.
Like, not just accepting information at face value, but questioning assumptions, considering alternative perspectives, and really scrutinizing sources.
It's about asking why.
Exactly.
Like, why is this happening? Or
Why should I believe this?
yeah, what's the evidence?
Yeah, what are the biases?
Yeah.
Like, really digging deep.
Okay, so we've talked about these two different types of thinking.
Right.
But how do they actually work together in the real world?
Yeah, let's look at some examples.
Okay, so the first one that came to my mind was Apple.
Oh, yeah, they're a great example.
Because I think a lot of people see Apple products and they're like, oh, that's so creative.
Yeah, the design is so sleek and simple and elegant.
But it's not just about aesthetics, right?
Right.
There's a lot of analytical thinking that goes into that design.
Absolutely. They have a very deep understanding of their users.
Yeah, like think about the iPhone, for example.
Okay.
When it first came out, it was like mind-blowing.
Yeah, getting rid of the physical keyboard.
Totally.
That was a huge risk.
But it paid off.
And it was such a creative solution to the problem of like, how do you make a phone that's easy to use and has a big screen?
Yeah, and then all of the gestures, like pinching and zooming and all that.
That was so innovative at the time.
Just so creative. But it was all based on like
Yeah, a lot of user testing and
research and like understanding how people actually use their phones.
yeah. And I think that's a great example of how creative thinking and analytical thinking work together.
Yeah, because you need that creative spark to come up with the initial idea.
Right.
But then you need analytical thinking to refine it and make sure it actually works.
Exactly.
Okay, let's look at a different example. Marketing.
Okay. Yeah.
So marketing used to be a lot more like gut feeling.
Very much so.
Like, oh, I think people will like this.
Right.
But now it's so data-driven.
Huge amounts of data.
Right. So everything is about like understanding your customers, tracking their behavior, and then personalizing your campaigns based on that data.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's all about using analytical thinking to understand what works and what doesn't work.
Right. And to make those decisions.
Exactly.
And to measure your results.
Yeah. There's a lot of emphasis now on ROI.
Yes.
Like proving that your marketing campaigns are actually generating revenue.
Exactly.
And data is key for that.
And I think we've seen some really cool examples of this. Like,
oh, yeah, like Netflix.
Yeah. So they use all of this data that they collect on what people are watching to decide what kind of content to create.
Right. Like they saw that people were really into like binge watching TV shows.
Yeah.
And that led them to create their own original series.
And it's been so successful for them.
Massively successful.
So that's like a really good example of how data analysis can actually lead to creative decisions.
Right. It's not just about crunching numbers. It's about using those numbers to inform your creative strategy.
Yeah, it's about understanding what people want.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about Edward de Bono for a second.
Okay.
So he was a psychologist,
Uh-huh.
and he came up with this concept of lateral thinking.
Well, yeah, I've heard of that.
So it's basically about thinking outside the box.
Yeah, like coming up with ideas that are unexpected and unconventional.
Yes, exactly. And he makes this distinction between lateral thinking and vertical thinking.
Okay.
So vertical thinking is like that traditional, logical, step-by-step approach to problem solving.
Right.
Whereas lateral thinking is more about like disrupting patterns and challenging assumptions.
Right.
And he has all these different techniques for generating lateral thinking, like
Yeah, like what?
like random entry, where you just pick a random word or object
oh, wow.
and try to connect it to your problem.
Interesting.
Or provocation, where you make a statement that's impossible
Yeah.
and then see where that leads you.
So it's about like shaking things up.
Yeah, getting out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. And then there's IDEO. Oh, IDEO.
So they're like a world-renowned design firm.
Yeah.
And they have this really cool design thinking methodology.
It's very popular.
Yeah, and it's all about understanding human needs.
Yeah, it's very human-centered.
Yeah, so they have these different phases like inspiration, ideation, experimentation.
It's a very iterative process.
Yeah, it's not linear. You kind of go back and forth between the different phases.
Right. And I think one of the key things about their methodology is the emphasis on prototyping and testing.
Yeah, getting feedback early and often.
Exactly.
And then they have this really interesting framework for evaluating ideas.
Oh, yeah. What is it?
It's called desirability, feasibility, viability.
Okay.
So basically it's asking, is this idea something that people actually want?
Desirability.
Yeah, can we actually build it?
Feasibility.
And does it make business sense?
Viability.
Yeah.
That's a really good framework.
Yeah, I like it a lot.
Yeah, it makes you think about all the different aspects of an idea.
So we've talked about all these different concepts.
But I think it's helpful to see some real-world examples of how these things are actually being used.
Yeah, definitely.
So the Harvard Business Review has a bunch of case studies
Oh, cool.
that I think are really relevant. So one of them is about GE Healthcare.
Okay.
And they were trying to figure out how to make MRI machines less scary for kids.
Oh.
Because they're really loud and claustrophobic.
Yeah.
So they actually redesigned the machines to look like pirate ships and spaceships.
Oh, wow.
And they created these whole interactive experiences.
That's so cool.
So that was a really creative solution to a problem.
Yeah, and it was driven by empathy.
Exactly.
Like really understanding the needs of the users.
Yeah, and then another example is Microsoft.
Okay.
So they were trying to figure out how to optimize their office space.
Mm.
So they collected all this data on how employees were actually using the space,
Okay.
like which rooms were being used the most at what times of day.
Yeah.
And then they used that data to make decisions about how to redesign the office.
That's smart.
Yeah. And then another example is Uber.
Okay.
So they use A/B testing all the time
Right.
to figure out which features are most effective.
So they'll show different versions of the app to different users
Exactly.
and then track which version performs better.
Yeah, so it's like a really data-driven approach to product development.
It's all about continuous improvement.
Yeah.
So I think what all of these examples show is that the most successful innovations aren't just creative or just analytical.
Right.
It's the combination of the two.
Yes, exactly. Like you need that initial creative spark,
Uh-huh.
but then you need to be able to analyze and refine your ideas.
To make sure they're actually going to work
Right.
in the real world.
So the key takeaway for our listeners
Yeah.
is that you need to develop both your creative thinking skills and your analytical thinking skills.
Absolutely.
Because they're both equally important.
Yeah, and they work best when they're used together.
So how can people actually do that?
Well, I think there are a lot of different ways, like engaging in activities that stimulate your creativity,
Like what kind of things?
like visual arts or writing, or even just like taking a different route to work. Anything that gets you out of your routine.
Yeah.
And then for analytical thinking, things like solving logic puzzles or working on data analysis projects.
Yeah.
Or even just like having conversations with people who have different perspectives.
Right. That's a good one.
Yeah, just anything that challenges your thinking.
So here's a final thought for our listeners.
Okay.
Think about a challenge that you're currently facing in your life and try to come up with some unusual solutions using a lateral thinking technique.
Okay.
And then once you have a few ideas, use your analytical skills to evaluate them
Yeah.
and see which one has the most potential.
I love that.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance between those two different ways of thinking.
That sweet spot
Yes, exactly.
where the magic happens.
Thanks for diving deep with us.
That was fun.
Yeah, this was a good one.
It was really
I'm
interesting.
glad you liked it.
I did.